Hi, everybody. Welcome. So continuing with Intro Psych Chapter 6 and continuing this week 5. Alrighty. So let me pull up my screen and call this up. Very good. Okay, folks. So what we will be doing today, we'll be going over some theories in learning. Okay. These theories and perspectives on how human behavior is acquired has had a major role in shaping psychology as a research in its research arena, but also in its clinical arena. Okay, we'll be looking at some of the major theories, including classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and I might touch also upon observational learning, which has had a huge role as well. Okay, I'm gonna bypass a bunch of stuff here. We might get back to that at a later point. But let's first talk about what is learning. Okay, learning refers to a relatively, not definitely, absolutely, but relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience. Yeah, so let's use learning Spanish, right? So you take a semester of Spanish, you can speak several phrases, you can kind of get around town. But, you know, if you end up never after that semester, never speaking it, never using it, probably after a few years, you'd lose a lot of that knowledge and you wouldn't be able to demonstrate speaking many of those phrases you knew before. Maybe a couple, but not nearly as much. If you've never spoken Spanish for a few years since your one semester Spanish class. Okay, so that's what we mean by relatively permanent change. Yeah, although the interesting thing is that if you took a refresher course of even, you know, just a few hours, probably a lot of that would come back to you. Okay, but we'll leave that off for a chapter on memory at a later time. Okay. Now, associative learning refers to learning that two or more events occur together, associating two or more stimuli. Yeah, we'll look at example of a bell ringing for dinner bell and salivating, or two stimuli maybe occur across time. Yeah, so it may be learning that when you get a right answer, someone smiles at you, like your instructor, or you know, if you say a nice thing to somebody, they smile at you, right? That's a consequence. So the two stimuli are what you say, right? The correct answer, the nice thing, and the consequence, your reward. So those are two stimuli, associating two circumstances stimuli in time. And generally, you can refer to those that kind of learning as associative learning. Okay, making associations, and that's a huge part of so much of learning. Yeah, being able to associate two stimuli together. Okay, now conditioning is a process of learning at those associations, and how we are conditioned. There are different ways. Okay, there's classical conditioning, in which we learn to anticipate events. Alrighty, so the dog hears the bell ringing, that dinner is ready, or the cat hears the can operator, right, the can opener, and then figures, hey, there's some tuna going to be hitting my dinner plate. Okay, so they can anticipate things. Um, so that's what a lot of classical conditioning is. We'll parse that out a little further. Operant conditioning is learning a response, the relationship between a response, like saying something nice, and a consequence, right? Seeing a smiling face, alrighty? And observational learning is another process of learning associations, but learning by, by um, um, observing a model do something. Yeah, and here we're talking model broadly, right? Could be like a child watching a parent, right? You watching a YouTube video, someone trying to like play a musical instrument or cook something, and then you following, learning that by observation, being able to imagine that, see the steps, understand what you need to do, and also appreciate the fact that if you follow what you can imagine, that you're going to accomplish something, right? So there's also ways we learn by observing and imagining and then following those behaviors, like copying a model. Okay, related to that is a lot of brain stuff, obviously. Yeah, because anything psychological, behavioral, emotional is also going to be biological. Okay, not either or. Yeah, and here a relevant concept is the idea of synaptic plasticity. Okay, and it's the idea that as we learn associations, yeah, as we're kind of by and we learn by way of classical operant conditioning, observational learning, that we're changing the neurons in our brain. Yeah. And that, and really the idea is that neuronal change is an important component underlying learning. Yeah. And what is happening to the neuron is that it's becoming more sensitive to firing a neurochemical impulse down the axon. Yeah. It's becoming more sensitive, more likely to, yeah. Um, and to send out a signal to do so more efficiently. Okay, so those connections between neurons increase. Right, we can even see this increase in the increase on the axon, right, of the myelin sheath. Right, the more learning that takes place, or type of learning at different parts of the brain, different neurons will grow in terms of their connections. And where we see that growth, again, one way we can see that growth is in terms of the myelin sheath growth, right? That fatty tissue around the axon. As that develops, the signal is able to travel quicker and more efficiently along the axon. Okay, and so where does increase signal? Where does the increase in signal? What is it related to? It's related to an increase in receptors in the adjoining neurons. The presynaptic terminal become more sensitive, as just mentioned, or excitable, which leads to an increase in connection strength. Yeah, and also the formation of even more synapses or connections. Alrighty. So whatever we're learning, be it a language, driving a car, playing a musical instrument, memorizing lines to a play, okay? Different neurons, depending on which part of the brains are invoked more, will develop further in a strength as well as in complexity. All right, so what is classical conditioning? Okay. Classical conditioning is a way by which we associate two stimuli, yeah, and one stimuli serves as a signal, yeah, that for another for a response. Okay, now here, so we're talking about it. We start off with what's referred to as an unconditioned stimulus, leading to, right, an unconditioned response. All righty, so these are the two circumstances to stimulate, but here specifically an unconditioned stimulus with an unconditioned response. All righty, now they're referred to as unconditioned because there's no learning involved. Okay, this is just the beginning of the process. Okay, these are connections that are hardwired, genetic, come from our evolution. Yeah, so for example, if you smell some really good food, right, meat cooking, okay, and you start salivating, that is an unconditioned response. Okay? We're hardwired to have that kind of response to the smell of meat. Yeah. Another kind of hardwired response we have is if we perceive depth, right? So even among older infants and young children, yeah, they can appreciate depth, right? If they look over a cliff, right, they will kind of back off a bit, right, because they sense the depth and they kind of have that fear response. That's hardwired, okay? That's a matter of our genetics. That's what we evolved to do. Okay? And there are actually numerous unconditioned response stimuli and responses, yeah, that we possess. Alrighty, but from that grouping of hardwired unconditioned connections between a UCS and a UCR, we can also have a lot of other learning through the process of classical conditioning. So this is the first step or first part of classical conditioning. Now, the next thing that can occur, okay, is an association between, okay, a conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Yeah. So the first relationship was, I'm sorry, I may have said stimulus, but it's unconditioned stimulus with a UCR, a response. Now, here we have the association of two stimuli. the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Now, how can this occur? Okay. This can occur if a stimulus, like a bell, occurs before an unconditioned stimulus. Yeah. So, for example, if let's just say there's a ringing of a bell, right, to kind of notify people that dinner is going to be on the table, or for dogs that meat's going to be served in their cage or wherever they keep the dogs. Okay. So the bell serves as a notice, right, to anticipate that the unconditioned stimulus is going to come around the corner. All right, the meat, which produces the unconditioned response to salivation. Now, if you present the CS before the UCS a few times or several times, but it really only probably requires a few times, yeah, what happens is that the CS becomes associated with the UCS such that after a number of pairings, the CS produces a conditioned response, which is what was formerly referred to as the unconditioned response. But after a few sessions of learning trials, yeah, the conditioned stimulus, the stimulus of the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus, leading to a conditioned response. It's called the conditioned response because now the dog has learned it, right? It's been conditioned. Yeah? So now the salivation is a conditioned response. So every time they hear the bell, right? Because before the bell was presented before the food, let's just say before there was any conditioning, right? If a bell was rung, maybe a dog would have some kind of response, right? It might jump up and down and stuff like that, which might be actually a hardwired unconditioned response to hearing a loud noise. Okay? But if that bell is now presented immediately before the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, and it's done through a few learning trials, right, it becomes a conditioned stimulus for the unconditioned response, which now becomes a conditioned response, alrighty, because it's been learned. All right, so now just the mere ringing of the bell, you don't even have to show the meat, just the ringing of the bell would produce salivation. And that's what Ivan Pavlov, who developed the theory of classical conditioning, observed. Yeah, he was actually doing a study examining digestive processes. Yeah, he was a physiologist, and he was examining how a saliva would digest food. Alrighty, part of the study involved animals, dogs, and between the experiments, they would feed the dogs, and he made the observation that every time the researchers rang the bell to alert the dogs that dinner was ready, right, he would notice the dogs were salivating even before the meat was presented. So, because he was a good scientist, he was very observant. And Pavlov started to wonder if there was this connection that was occurring. And through a number of studies and observations, he came to the conclusion that, dogs were learning along the process that I just described. And that's classical conditioning. Now, once a conditioned stimulus is associated with a conditioned response, there are a lot of ways this learning may manifest itself. Okay? One of the ways is by way of generalization. Okay, so what does that refer to? Well, as the term kind of suggests, it relates to how the response, the conditioned response, might generalize, or relate to, or be connected to similar conditioned stimuli. In other words, would dogs salivate also to the sound of other bells of different frequencies and so on? And lo and behold, that's what Pavlov found. With smaller bells, larger bells, bells of different tones, they would also produce salivation. So in other words, there was generalization of the conditioned stimuli. Okay. Interesting enough, he also found in later studies that the amount of salivation would differ according to the characteristics of the types of differing conditioned stimuli. So if there was a larger bell, made a louder noise, it may produce more salivation. A smaller bell, which produced a lower volume ringing, would produce less salivation. That there actually be a relationship between the conditioned response and the different types of generalized associations. He also found another characteristic of a classical condition, which is discrimination. And that the animals, the dogs, could distinguish between a CS which predicts the UCS and one that doesn't predict the UCS. So similarly with the bells of different sizes producing different frequencies, one of the things Pavlov did was he tried to see if the dogs could learn to discriminate between a bell that would anticipate actual food being brought versus bells that didn't predict for that. Yeah. So bells of, let's say, lower, higher frequencies, he'd have his researchers ring, but there'd be no food presented. There'd be no pairing, right? There'd only be pairing with the bell with a certain frequency. Then the food would be presented, and the dogs would be able to develop those associations, would be able to, and which they did. Yeah, they wouldn't salivate nearly as much or at all to bells with lower or higher frequencies, but only to the bell of the chosen frequency. So they could discriminate between stimuli which would produce the, which would lead to a, which they would anticipate would lead to the unconditioned stimulus, which would then produce the conditioned response. And finally, you could have what's referred to as extinction. Yeah, could you kind of unlearn through classical conditioning? And what Pavlov did was with the original bell, could you have the ringing, but then no presentation of the unconditioned stimulus? Would that then lead to a disconnect between the previously learned conditioned stimulus and conditioned response? And lo and behold, that's what happened. When they would ring the bell and there'd never be a presentation, and then they stopped presenting the unconditioned stimulus, the dogs had to learn, hey, there's no meat coming around the corner. Why bother salivating? And their salivation decreased significantly, if not almost disappear. Okay, so they could extinguish a conditioned response. Now, one of the interesting findings is that with extinction was this phenomenon referred to as spontaneous recovery. Yeah. So if here the y-axis indicates degree or amount of salivation, and then the extinction trials, right? The presentation of the CS without the UCS, right? What would happen? There'd be less salivating, right? It'll almost disappear. However, if there was a gap between this learning trial, right, and not a long gap, but a short period of time between that, and then the next learning trial, and then they rang the bell again, they found that salivation increased again, not nearly as high, right, because it extinguished, but it would kind of bounce back or jump back, or what they refer to as spontaneous recovery, which for Pavlov, and then if they continue with the extinction trials, the amount of salivation would decrease again in a similar manner. Okay. But what this demonstrated to Pavlov is that what extinction may be is not actually a disappearance of the conditioned response, but maybe it's more of an inhibition of the conditioned response. That we kind of learn to not respond, that connection is still there, but we just learn not to bother with it or not to behave accordingly. Alrighty. On the matter of specific phobias, excuse me, just took a little Red Bull break there. One of the things that, now the classical conditioning model applies to many things, many kinds of learning, yeah, that you can take an unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response and pair that unconditional stimulus with what was formerly a neutral stimulus, make it a conditioned stimulus, which can now elicit the unconditioned response, but which is now referred to as a conditioned response, yeah. One of the ways that this may play out, well, one of the ways that it applies to is with specific phobias, okay, like fear of dogs and so on. And what it appears is that a lot of specific phobias, like we have of dogs, of like heights and so on, that very well, that the classical conditioning framework or model really nicely explains how we acquire these kinds of phobias. Yeah. When we meet face to face, we'll discuss this topic a little further, okay? But I'll just leave it at that for now. But just to, well, in terms of the different types of specific phobias, we'll have a discussion about that later. But I just want to use one example here, and here is like to illustrate or talk about the case of little Albert. Okay, you may have heard about this case. Little Albert was a child of a staff member at a research hospital. Alrighty, and what the researchers wanted to examine, it was John Watson with Elizabeth Rayner. What they wanted to determine, and I think that's Elizabeth Rayner in the photo, is whether through classical conditioning, a child can learn to have a phobia to a small white rabbit. Alrighty? So what they first started off with was an understanding of the relationship of an unconditioned stimulus, in this case, a loud noise, with a fear response. Okay. In other words, what we're hardwired, genetically predisposed to associate with a loud noise is having an anxiety response, a fear response, right? If someone were to sneak up behind you and then just, yell or like hit a pot with a stick, going bang, 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 bang right behind your head, sneak up behind you and do that, you would have a startle response, right? You jump, then you'd be very angry. But initially you'd have a response, right? And you'd be kind of anxious, your heart would be racing, you might be sweating a little. Okay, that's a natural response. We're hardwired to have that response, right? To be surprised by a loud noise and then responding with a fear response. Okay, that we developed through evolution. That's a good survival reaction, right? If you hear a loud noise, you're surprised by a loud noise, you kind of get a little startled, a little scared, and your heart races and you're ready for action, maybe taking flight, okay, or fight. Now, you can take that original pairing, right? And what Rayner and Watson predicted was that they could teach someone to have extend that fear response, generalize it, or through classical conditioning, develop an association with another conditioned stimulus. Now, in this case, what they did was that the subject here was little Albert, right? He was an infant, and they presented to him a little white rabbit, righty, which Albert had no fear of because it was a cute little quiet, soft rabbit. He would touch the rabbit, pet it, right, want to play with it. He had no fear until later. So what they did was at a subsequent session, they had Albert again presented with the rabbit, but then one of the researchers approached Albert from behind and then hit a pot with a kind of wooden spoon very loudly, just went bang, 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 right behind Albert's head, scaring him, right? So he had a startle response and he started crying, which is what infants do. And, they're in a bad mood. And, adults, I don't know if they burst out crying, but they certainly would be in a foul mood. Certainly would be upset if someone did that to them. And they did that a few times to poor Albert. What happened? Well, what happened was, right, they would present the rabbit, they sneak up behind Albert and then produce a loud noise. And what happened is much like the bell ringing, right, in Pavlov's experiment, became a warning signal for the dogs to anticipate meat. Okay. In this instance, instead of a bell, it was the white rabbit. Has now become something that would notify Albert that there might be an unconditioned stimulus coming around, like a loud response, a loud noise. Yeah. So much like the bell ringing, instead of producing something pleasant like salivation, here the white rabbit produced a fear response. So every time you saw the white rabbit, now without even the noise being around, right, it was just kind of burned into him that something bad is going to happen, right? So every time he saw the white rabbit, he would anticipate this shocking experience. So he would then start crawling away from the rabbit, and generalize to other white fluffy things like bathroom slippers, bathroom floor rug, which was white. And he just acquired this anxiety response to white rabbits and anything that reminded him of a white rabbit. Horrible, horrible case study. Alrighty, but a classic, nice illustration of classical conditioning. By the way, as kind of an epilogue, the researchers did want to kind of cure him of the fear that they had instilled into little Albert, and they were going to treat him by doing some counter conditioning. We'll get into that in a moment. But little Albert's parents would have none of that and took him out of the study. So that was the end of Watson and Rayner's relationship with little Albert. Okay. Well, what I just described to you regarding little Albert is also the theory or framework that's used to understand PTSD. Yeah. So when people experience traumatic events, like a traumatic event would be something like a hurricane, or being fired at in battle, or being assaulted or raped, right? All of those things were hardwired to have a fear response, an intense one, right? If we're in the middle of a hurricane, if we're being attacked, right? Our genes, our body is going to respond naturally, instinctively, automatically, right? With a fear response, a fight or flight response, and so on. Okay. Now, if those occurrences, like being mugged or being in battle or being in a hurricane, occur, they could be through classical conditioning associated with certain stimuli. For example, in combat, right? If if in the a scene of battle, occurs, and it occurs in, let's say in Iraq, right? The individual could be classically conditioned to that kind of environment, right? In terms of temperature, sand, types of people, such that when the person encounters those stimuli later, sometimes years later, right? Those stimuli can serve as a conditioned stimuli, just like the bell ringing, just like the white rabbit, to produce an intense anxiety response, like being shot at, or being attacked. So that's the idea. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why PTSD is difficult to treat. Very treatable, and a lot of research to support psychological interventions, but it takes hard work. Yeah. Now, what type of treatment has been found to be particularly effective in the treatment of PTSD? Yeah. What type of treatment is referred to as exposure? Okay. And it takes advantage of the classical conditioning theories um, explanation and finding regarding extinction. Yeah. That if you can have the patient or client be exposed to the conditioned stimulus, yeah, it may be the image of an Iraq village, or of someone of Middle Eastern background, for example, yeah, or the sound of you know uh, like a car engine, right? Car engines sometimes make that kicking, exploding sound, right? Expose a person to those sounds, those images, and so on, without the unconditioned stimulus being present, yeah. But then, also in addition, utilizing things such as relaxation techniques, meditation techniques, and so on. Yeah. Also cognitive techniques, utilizing things they can say to themselves to calm themselves down, like they'll live through this. They're not going to die, that what they're experiencing is unpleasant. If they can go through, you can think of them as training trials, where they're exposed to the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. Right? They're feeling the conditioned response, but now without the unconditioned stimulus, but also through other means that I just mentioned, other uh, uh, meditative relaxation, cognitive techniques, yeah, that the connection between the CS and the CR can be weakened, okay? In some cases, broken, such that the person doesn't have the PTSD symptoms with the CS. Okay. Now, in most cases, the person probably will always have a slight reaction to the conditioned stimulus, some kind of fear response, but they can manage it much better. Yeah, they won't have as intense a need to escape a situation, or they won't have nearly as intense an anxiety response where they feel like they're having a heart attack, or they feel like they're going to die, or they're in complete terror. Yeah, and that's a huge clinical benefit. If you can take a client or patient from feeling that whenever they hear anything that reminds them of the war, Yeah, instead of feeling absolute abject terror, they just feel some discomfort, some anxiety, and so on. That's a huge change, a change that can allow them to keep a job, keep their relationships, and so on. Yeah, and manage their lives and survive and thrive after a difficult traumatic event. Okay. We'll probably, when we meet face to face, we'll probably talk about how we're biologically predisposed to learn certain fears. And with that, I'd like to continue with operant conditioning. But let me just stop here for a moment. Okay, hi, welcome back. Just took a quick Red Bull break. But let's get back to my screen here and talk about operant conditioning. All right, so this is the second traditional school of thought regarding how we learn, how humans learn, well, other species as well, and it's related to associating two stimuli. Now, the things that are being associated here are behaviors and consequences. Okay, so if a little boy acts in a disruptive manner, right, and he gets a spank on the behind, he associates his acting in a disruptive manner with a punishment, right, a punishing stimuli, and that will probably decrease that behavior. Okay. Whereas maybe somebody else says something nice to someone, gives them a compliment, and that person returns that compliment with a smile or a hug or thanks or whatever, something positive, right? Well, now that person learned that saying a compliment is followed by a reinforcer, an interpersonal reinforcer, right? And there are hundreds of different kinds of interpersonal reinforcers, also punishers as well, right? So that's the idea, is you associate a behavior with a consequence, all right? So let's flesh this out a little further. And by the way, the person who developed this idea was B.F. Skinner, all righty? And let's look at his framework, his theory, the theory of operant conditioning. Now, Skinner generated his ideas in the 40s and 50s, a lot of it from single case studies of pigeons and mice, okay, and examining the effect of reinforcement and punishment on their behavior. Okay? So a lot of it actually arose from these individual animal studies. He also did human studies, and what he found were very similar patterns and learning curves related to behavior and their consequences. Okay. Just like classical conditioning, when certain behaviors are learned, right, like saying something nice, or they're either decreased, like getting punished for acting rambunctiously, alrighty, that just like with classical conditioning, we can have these different characteristics of the learned behavior. Behavior can be extinguished, right? So for example, if someone brings a rose to his girlfriend or boyfriend, right, and then they get a big hug or a kiss on the cheek or something, right, they're more likely that's going to increase rose-giving behavior. Right? But if that boyfriend or girlfriend stops giving a hug or ignores them every time they bring a rose, that's going to decrease the probability that that person is going to bring a rose to his boyfriend or girlfriend, right? So we have what's referred to as an extinction of the behavior, just as with classical conditioning, right? You can also have generalization, alrighty? So for example, if someone learns to say nice things to their family members, yeah, and family members go, oh, thanks, Tommy, or a pat on the head, a smile, a hug from mom. Right? Tommy might learn to perform those same behaviors with school friends, with teachers, and with other people, and get similarly reinforced. In other words, we have a generalization of the originally learned positive behaviors. And we can also discriminate, just as with Pavlov's dogs, they learn to discriminate the unconditioned stimulus, the presentation of the meat with certain bells at certain frequencies, right? One can learn to discern whether certain situations will be reinforcing or punishing. Yeah. So maybe Tommy may learn to say nice things, to give compliments to people, to family and friends, but he may find that that doesn't work so swell with certain male friends or with, let's say, bosses or instructors, that they don't respond nearly as consistently, right? Some do, some when they're complimented, and others are kind of like, hey, you know, what are you trying to get at? Get from me, right? So some people may be a little more cautious, right? And I said men, but also women, right? In certain situations, right? If he's pouring it on kind of thick, the compliments, okay, in a dating situation with men or women, right? They might get, all right, hey, hold it back there. So he may learn what kinds of situations to give the compliments and which ones not to. As mentioned before, with operant conditioning, what's being associated or paired is behavior with a consequence. Okay. Now, what is a reinforcer? I'd thrown the term out kind of quickly a moment ago. Okay. A reinforcer is any consequence that leads to an increase of a behavior. All righty. So, but there are actually two types of reinforcers: one positive, one negative. It's really important to understand the difference between the two. Okay. Now, positive reinforcer is one in which you get an increase in a response by the presentation of the desired stimulus. So, a classic positive reinforcer would be like a kiss from a boyfriend or girlfriend, right? You give a rose, they give you a kiss on the cheek, you go, hey, all right, I did the right thing, right? So, you're more likely to it increases the probability of rose giving behavior. Now, there's also this concept of negative reinforcement. Now, negative reinforcer is you increase the response by the removal, right? Not the presentation of something desired, but the removal of something aversive. Okay. So, what would be an example? So maybe one way to increase garbage taking behavior would be a roommate is nagging Tommy, right? Says, hey, Tommy, take out the trash. Hey, Tommy, take out the trash. 10 minutes later, hey, Tommy, what about that trash, right? Nag, 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 nag. Just kind of constantly poking at Tommy there to take out the trash. And finally, after the 25th time, Tommy goes, oh, I can't take out the damn trash, right? And then the person stops nagging. So Tommy's, oh, thank God that nagging stopped. Okay. What that was a nice illustration of was negative reinforcement. So the thing that increased the behavior or the probability of a behavior, in this case, it's taking out garbage, which is a behavior, right? That occurred because of the removal of the aversive stimulus. Alrighty. Now here's another example of a negative reinforcer. A behavior might be moving from the living room to the upstairs. Alrighty. Now, what caused that stair climbing behavior, for example? Right? Could have been the smoke of someone's cigar in the living room, right? And then Tommy's sitting there, he's thinking to himself, man, I can't take the smoke anymore. So he decides, I'm going to go upstairs, right? So what increased the probability of the stair walking behavior by Tommy? It was by doing that, he was able to remove the aversive stimulus in this case, the cigar. Alrighty. So you just got important thing to keep in mind is that a reinforcement is anything that increases the behavior. Alrighty. That's how you kind of understand. That's how you do an operant conditioning analysis. Okay? You can determine whether something is a reinforcer or punisher based on the target behavior of interest. Okay. If the target behavior of interest is something you want to increase, you want to think in terms of a reinforcer would be the presentation of something positive that would increase that behavior, or the removal of something aversive that would increase that behavior. Okay? Now, relevant to this, as touched on before, is anything that's going on behaviorally is also affecting things biologically, alrighty? And here, what's going to be affected is dopamine, okay, that neurotransmitter, and specifically something in the brain called the dopaminergic system. Okay. Now, when someone gets reinforced, right, there's removal of cigar smoke is, oh, now I can smell some clean air, or getting a peck on the cheek from a boyfriend or girlfriend, right? This triggers the production of dopamine, or dopamine receptors become particularly sensitive to dopamine. Alrighty, and that's the reward system. Okay, the dopaminergic system is involved in, you know, processing the experience of a reward. Alrighty, so the reward neurons trigger dopamine and and respond to rewarding aspects of the stimulus. Here being here the stimuli being kissed or the removal of the cigar smoke. Okay. Alrighty, moving right along. Oh, I like this little quote. It's from the, I think it's from the uh, Hindu text. And it says, give praise to everyone who tells the truth. Tell them, quote, everything you say is great. When people do the right thing, tell them you approve and give them your encouragement. Yeah, probably most of us do this most of the time, but sometimes, you know, we may overlook reinforcing people, congratulating them, thanking them, praising them when they do the right thing at work, in class. Yeah, we just kind of take it for granted, like they should do that. Well, if we want them to do that and we want to increase the likelihood of them doing that, we should reward them in some way. And again, as I mentioned, when it comes to reinforcement, there are all kinds of reinforcement. There's all kinds of interpersonal reinforcement. Yeah. And that's part of being a psychologist, is understanding what is a reinforcer or what is a punishing experience for people. Yeah, a lot of the interpersonal reinforcers are some of the things I just mentioned. Other things which are really powerful are things like eye contact, a smile, yeah? Even sometimes a head nod, you know, nodding of the head, a wink. All those things can be really powerful reinforcers. Yeah, and shouldn't be taken for granted in terms of their power if you want to see something more frequently. Yeah. Now, reinforcement can also be provided, whether it's a kiss, eye contact, pat on the head, candy, money, whatever the reinforcer is. Yeah, there are different schedules that you can administer the reinforcement. Alrighty, either intentionally or unintentionally. Reinforcement can be done on a continuous basis. Yeah, in other words, every time there's a performance of the behavior, there's a provision of the reinforcement. Yeah, so every time you get a rose, you give a kiss, something like that. Or it could be on a partial intermittent schedule. Yeah, reinforcement can be given occasionally, not every single time. Yeah, so maybe sometimes Tommy gets a kiss, sometimes he doesn't get a kiss. All right. Oh, sorry, he probably gets a thank you or something, right? But the positive reinforcement is intermittent. All righty. So it could be continuous or intermittent. Um, Now, there are four general types of reinforcement schedules. We just spoke about how they can be fixed, continuous, or variable, intermittent. Okay. They can also be based on ratio or time. Yeah. So it's either continuous or intermittent based on how many times a behavior is performed. Okay. So every time a behavior is performed, you get a reinforcer, or you intermittently give a reinforcer every time the behavior is performed. Another schedule would be you give reinforcement, right, at a fixed interval. So after a certain period of time, like kind of getting a paycheck every 2 weeks, that's a great example of a fixed interval schedule. Okay. A variable interval schedule is if you vary the time someone gets reinforced, right? So you pay them after day one or after a week or after a month and go back to a week, right? So you vary the time frame in which people get reinforced. Probably not so attractive, that reinforcement schedule. Based on these four different types of reinforcement schedules, you can get different kinds of learning curves, different kinds of responding. Alrighty. So let's look at a nice graph of that. Now, when you reinforce continuously every time a behavior is performed, you get really quick learning. Okay. Now, the learning curve, if you reinforce intermittently or you vary how many times per behavior, alrighty, you still get a fairly steep learning curve. Not as steep as this. It's a little lower, but not that much lower. Now, you can see when you continuously reinforce according to a time schedule, a fixed time schedule, right, the learning curve is not nearly as high. Yeah. The other thing is that you only get a lot of behavior occurring about when you get the reinforcement. In other words, the organism, right when it gets reinforced, it kind of plateaus and then starts behaving more when anticipating that it's going to get rewarded again, right? Anticipate, oh, okay, it's about the end of the week, 2 week period or whatever the time period may be. When it's a variable interval schedule, right, you vary the time, you can see that has the lowest learning curve. Now, what each of these learning curves illustrate, yeah, is the organism's ability to anticipate getting reinforced. Yeah. So when it's based on behavior, that's easier for the mouse, the pigeon, the human being to anticipate getting something or avoiding something aversive for their behavior. So that's why we see a steeper learning curve. Time tends to be a little more tends to be, you don't have as tight an association. Yeah, it's tighter when it's a fixed time interval of reinforcement, but not when it's variable. The other thing to keep in mind too, there's another big difference between fixed and variable ratio. When it's a fixed continuous reinforcement for every performance of behavior, you get very steep learning curve, very quick learning. But it's also quick to extinguish. Yeah. So if you always pay someone, give them a kiss every time they give a rose, every single time, right? But then you stop giving a rose, right? They might perform the rose giving behavior for a while, but then they're quicker to drop it. Okay. As opposed to when you sometimes give a kiss, sometimes don't give a kiss every time you give a rose, and you stop giving a kiss, right? They'll still do the rose giving behavior, but it won't disappear nearly as quickly as with a fixed ratio. And why is that the case? It's the case because it's harder for them to predict when they might actually get another reinforcer, because you had varied it before. Now it's harder for them to anticipate, hey, is that reinforcer not coming at all? And they'll hang on to that behavior. They'll perform that behavior for a longer period of time. Okay? It's slower to extinguish. This is just another way to think about a reinforcement schedule. It's kind of a nice summary. Ratio tends to have a higher learning curve than interval, reinforcement per behavior as opposed to per time. And continuous tends to have a steeper learning curve than variable or intermittent reinforcement. Alrighty, so what is a punishment? Okay, well, maybe take a little Red Bull break for a moment. Yummy. I'm back with you. Now, punishment, in contrast to a reinforcer, as you can kind of surmise, is anything that decreases a behavior. Alrighty? So any consequence that follows a behavior that decreases the behavior. So for a classic example is a little child acting rambunctiously, teasing his sister. Mom comes in, gives Tommy a spank on the behind, right? Tommy doesn't like that. It's going to decrease the probability that Tommy's going to act that way. And just like reinforcers, there are a whole range of different interpersonal punishers, right? You don't have to spank somebody. You can just kind of look at them harshly. You can raise your voice. You can say, Tommy, stop doing that. And that might be enough, right? Gee, if you do the old little Albert thing, you might, sneak up behind Tommy as he's teasing his sister, and you might just bark, Tommy, stop that. Tommy goes, ah! He kind of jumps. Don't know if I would recommend that, given what happened to the little Albert, or that very well could happen to Tommy, right? You don't want him having kind of a phobic response to his sister. But that could be real effective, right? Tommy's probably really less likely to be teasing his sister because he might anticipate the next time he does that, he's going to hear a loud noise again. Alrighty. But it can play out in all kinds of ways. Let's say interpersonally, right? You're having a conversation with somebody and they make a racist joke and you don't approve of that, right? You just don't laugh. You might just turn away or go, yeah, and look away. Or you might, just look at them, or you might just, not laugh, just kind of look down. Those are powerful punishers. Yeah, you don't have to smack somebody. Yeah, sometimes it's amazing how just looking away or lack of eye contact, how that is such a punishing experience for many people. Yeah, for children as well as for adults. You know, um, and or you might tell them, hey, that's not cool, something like that. Right? Different things for different people. And some things are punishers for others. Now, the thing you got to be careful with that, right? Sometimes things you think are punishment is actually reinforcement. So, for example, someone makes a racist joke and you tell them, oh, I can't believe you said that. And you start lecturing them, right? And they're kind of grinning as you're doing that. They're grinning because that actually you're, rolling your eyes, scoffing, and then trying to lecture them and be all moralistic. They're smiling because that's exactly what they wanted to get out of you, right? They wanted to yank your chain and your motor ran, and that's reinforcing to them, right? They feel power and control, and actually inadvertently you're increasing the probability they're going to do something like that again, right? So that's the work of the psychologist, to really understand what is the behavioral, and what's the consequence, what's occurring. Yeah. So when afterwards you go, oh, he made that racist joke again, I can't believe it, what's wrong with him? It's because maybe you might not be understanding the operant conditioning um, paradigm as it relates to that situation. Yeah, that actually what you're doing is not punishing them, but you're actually reinforcing them. Okay. We'll probably, when we meet face to face, have a discussion about parental use of corporal punishment. Okay. In other words, hitting, spanking, and so on. We'll talk about the legalities of it, the psychology of it, and so on. I like this quote from Skinner. A person does not act upon the world acts upon him. Um, he's not trying to, reduce the importance of personal agency. If anything, Skinner was a strong advocate that people could change their own behavior by changing the consequences that occur around them. That said, though, he was a firm believer in the power of the environment in terms of changing people. Yeah, and how people are affected by punishers and reinforcers, and something for you to think about. And when we meet face to face, we can have a discussion about it. How many of the behaviors you demonstrate is something to really think about and ponder. And behaviors, we're talking about tons of stuff, right? How you decide to comb your hair, how you decide whether to wear cologne or not, how you dress, how you speak, what you say, what your major is, all that kind of stuff. How have you been reinforced and or punished to behave the way you behave, or don't behave the way you um, that you're not demonstrating? How much of that is a function of the environment versus your actual choice? Yeah, is your choice, or the freedom of choice, an illusion, a feeling? It feels like you have free will, but do you actually have free will? That's something we can chat about at a later time. Moving right along, just want to talk very quickly about observational learning. Around the 70s and into the 80s and now, what really developed in large part from the work of the man pictured here, Albert Bandura, is a social learning model of learning, which posits that we can learn through classical and operant conditioning. It doesn't rule out, or argue against the impact of those two models, but it posits that people, but also other species as well, in varying ways, can learn by just observing. Yeah. So not necessarily experiencing the classical conditioning of a stimulus, and then are making that connection between a conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, or necessarily through operant conditioning, performing a behavior and then experiencing a consequence. That a lot of time we can learn by watching, watching a model, and whether that model is a friend, family member, right, parent, teacher, watching a YouTube video on how to play the ukulele or cook a meal. That just by watching, that we can imagine, what's going on. We can picture it, the sequence, the steps that can lead to success or avoid failure, avoid punishment. And there are tons of studies to support that. Yeah, that you don't have to learn necessarily by classical conditioning or operant conditioning, that you don't have to experience the consequence. Yeah. Again, it's not to say that those models don't operate. It's just saying or standing for the proposition that there's this other way you can learn as well without experiencing the consequences as in operant conditioning. There's some discussion here about the impact of who we observe and how the attractiveness of the model, if they're similar to us, things like that. The more attractive they are, and we're just not talking about pretty or handsome, but whether that person demonstrates certain strength like intelligence or leadership, or kindness. Yeah, is the model attractive? Yeah, the more the model demonstrates positive features like that, the more likely we're to copy them. Alrighty, the more they're like us as well in age, ethnic, racial background, nationality, and so on, the more likely we copy the model. Yeah, it probably has something to do with anticipating success. Yeah, so if someone who looks like us, talks like us, and so on, the more likely we think, oh, I'll succeed in doing that, playing the ukulele or making a meal. Now, regarding whether we can learn aggression through observation, it's kind of a yes no. There's certainly an impact of violent television, and there certainly has been there's been a number of studies to support the impact of violent pornography, versus nonviolent pornography in terms of fostering aggressive attitudes towards women, acting more aggressively towards women, and so on. But not just violent pornography, but also violent videos, right? And so on. But it's not simply that. It's not simply television or the internet making us violent, because that just doesn't, there's a lot of things that counter that, or violent video games. As you all may know, right? In the last couple of decades, violent video games have really, well, it's gone up and down, but certainly overall, it's a massive billion-dollar industry, right, globally. But that said, also violence in the world has gone down in the last couple of few decades. And in particular, the US, violent crimes have gone down despite violent video games going up. So it's not a simple relationship of violent video games or television and so on making us more violent. That said, other studies do show that watching violent videos, right, or including violent pornography, can increase our adhering to or acknowledging violent thoughts, images, uh, um, let's say, acting more aggressively, okay, like in a stern manner, or raising our voices, or our willingness to shock or think we're shocking a you know another subject in a study. Yeah, so there are some studies to show that as well, okay, but the picture is more complicated. Yeah, in that one of the things, and among the things that complicates the picture, is what exactly does violent video do to us? Yeah. Well, among the things that violent videos probably do to us, fairly consistently, the research has shown, is that it certainly lowers our inhibitions about acting aggressively. It has also been consistently found to increase our beliefs that the world is dangerous, despite the facts and the evidence showing that it's becoming less dangerous, actually, and at least in the United States, and actually in many other parts of the world too. But the U.S., in terms of violent felonies and murders, have been consistently going down in the last couple of decades. Yeah, but seeing violent videos certainly increases people's beliefs that the world is more violent. Yeah. So, those seem to be some of the ways the research does support in terms of how violent videos can contribute to, yeah, not directly cause. Yeah. So it is certainly something that can have an effect, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient. Yeah, there are other things that can cause or contribute to someone demonstrating an act of violence. Alrighty, but it is not necessary. But videos are certainly not necessary, and certainly are not sufficient to cause violent behavior. Alrighty. Oh, and certainly violent television and videos can certainly make us a little more numb when we see violence again in a subsequent video or in an actual situation. Yeah. So in terms of our tolerance, and that's a concerning factor too. Yeah. If we become more numb or tolerant, we're not as averse to images of violence. Yeah. So that can contribute to our acting violently or not being as bothered when we see violence. Okay. And with that, that's all I have to say. Let me get out of here. That's all I have to say about chapter 6 and learning. Um, and with that, thanks for the privilege of your time. And I look forward to seeing you the next time we meet. And look out for the next YouTube video. And otherwise, have a good one. Very good. Take care. Bye bye.